Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. He's also director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me back, June.
As you know, the far-right candidate Javier Milei was elected president of Argentina on Sunday by a large mandate. Did that surprise you?
The size of the victory surprised just about everybody. The polls suggested that Milei had a pretty good chance to win. Given the state of the economy and the unpopularity of the government, it shouldn't be too surprising that the opposition candidate won. But none of the polls predicted a nearly 12-point victory. So he won by a much larger margin than anybody anticipated.
Do you have any theory about why that happened?
No, Argentine polls tend to be often somewhat off the mark, and it may simply have something to do with polling error, but it does seem also that a lot of last-minute deciders decided in Milei's favor, and I haven't seen a really clear explanation for why that happened.
You've written a lot about the necessity of strong political parties for the success of democracy. Does Milei's election indicate the collapse of the Argentine political party system?
No, but it's definitely a sign of sickness. The kind of sad paradox is the Achilles heel of Argentine democracy throughout the 20th century was the absence of a viable conservative party. Conservatives, once suffrage was extended and elections were free in Argentina in the early part of the 20th century, the conservatives never again could win national elections. And because conservatives couldn't win elections, you often saw economic elites turning to the military to defend their interests. And one of the great accomplishments of Argentine democracy in the 21st century has been the construction, really for the first time ever, of a viable democratic center-right party. That's PRO, that is Mauricio Macri's party, that finally won. That was the first right-wing party ever to win a democratic election in Argentina in 2015 to finally resolve this problem of the absence of a solid conservative party. And the Argentine party system just 5 years ago was actually in reasonably good shape, better shape than it had been a decade or 15 years earlier. But Milei defeated the established right-wing parties. They would have been called the Let's Change or the Together for Change coalition, the center-right coalition, into a tailspin, and has kind of possibly just his victory may have destroyed 2 decades of conservative party building in Argentina. This is the first time since Perón that an outsider has won the presidency, has defeated established parties. So it's a sign of sickness. It's not necessarily the death knell. It will depend now on how the parties respond.
Interesting. Most of our listeners have probably heard a lot about Milei himself, but could you talk a bit about his vice president? What does she represent and what impact is she likely to have?
I don't know how much impact she'll have. Vice presidents in Argentina often have very little influence, often like the United States and other presidential democracies. And so it's entirely possible that she will end up being a pretty marginal figure. But what she potentially represents is something I think dangerous for Argentine democracy, which is an open challenge to the consensus around never again that emerged in Argentina after the military trials of 1985. One of the greatest accomplishments of Argentine democracy in the last 40 years was the forging of a broad societal consensus that ranged from left to right around the fact that the military committed horrendous human rights abuses during the Dirty War, and that should never happen again, that the military should be out of politics forever. And Vicky Villarreal is someone who comes from a military family, who's been close to Videla and other former military officials from the Dirty War, and has spent her adult life effectively lobbying on behalf of the old military regime and questioning this consensus, questioning the number of people who may have been killed or disappeared, pushing the notion that the left was just as much to blame for the violence and repression is the right, and basically pushing the message that the military dictatorship wasn't really so bad, and in a sense working to deflate this strong consensus of never again. And I think that if if she gains prominence and is given a soapbox or a bully pulpit, she's going to probably push that agenda. That's been her life agenda over the last couple of decades. She's talked about shutting down the Human Rights Museum that was created in the naval installations under Kirchner, and sort of beginning to undermine the pro-human rights consensus that's emerged in the country in the last few decades.
That would seem to be a situation that would lead to a lot of polarization. But talking about polarization, what are you seeing on the ground right now?
Well, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so I'm not seeing too much on the ground in Argentina. But you can look at Milei in one of two ways. And I think there is polarization in Argentina, to be sure. You could look at him as an ultra-libertarian, and you can see it through the lens of kind of extreme left-right polarization. The Kirchneristas came from the left. Milei comes from the far, far right. And there's some truth to that. He is an ultra-libertarian. But his victory was, although clearly a victory for the right, it was mostly a vote of anger. It's not the case that 55% of Argentines were voting for ultra-libertarian policies. 55% of Argentines were voting against the status quo, were voting against the incumbents, and were voting to give what they perceive as a failed political establishment a little punch in the gut. So this was a vote of anger rather than a vote for libertarianism.
What are the challenges facing Milei once he takes office?
He has a lot of challenges. First of all, he is totally inexperienced. The guy's never run anything in his life. He's never held elected office. The record, looking back at other outsiders in Latin America, is not great. It's usually relatively experienced politicians who are able to govern. Argentina is a big, difficult country to govern, and so putting an amateur at the helm is risky. He also risks political isolation. His party only has a small fragment of the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, controls very few large cities or provinces. And so because he doesn't have a political party, he risks political isolation. He's almost certainly going to have to forge an alliance with the mainstream right-wing party, the PRO. But even that is not going to get him a legislative majority. So he's going to face a Supreme Court that is predominantly Kirchnerista. He's going to face a legislature that's mostly Peronist. And he's also going to face a pretty strong civil society, which will mobilize to defend its rights. So if he does what he says he's going to do and goes for radical economic reform, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea on the chalkboard, that's going to trigger opposition from unions and other social actors in Argentina. If he does what some of his supporters and allies want him to do, which is to begin to march backward on issues of social rights, whether it's abortion or gay rights or human rights, I can guarantee you he's going to generate significant civil society opposition, especially among young people. Argentines are not afraid of political protest, and they will protest. And what I worry about is how an amateur politician with, I think it's safe to say, fairly authoritarian reflexes will respond to protest.
Do you anticipate that he might moderate in order to govern?
I think so. I mean, this is the choice that anti-system outsiders face. So the short answer is yes, I think there is a decent chance that he will moderate because, in a sense, it's the rational thing to do. It's going to be very difficult for him to govern and be successful if he alienates himself. So I think there's a very good chance he will at least partially moderate. But there are, broadly speaking, three scenarios that we can expect. One is a scenario of total failure in which he isolates himself and quickly loses political support and maybe is run out of town before the end of his presidency. Think about Pedro Castillo in Peru, another political amateur, this one from the left, not the right. The other extreme is the Bukele scenario, where he continues to rail against the political elite and gains massive support in doing so, and is able even to use that massive support to undermine democratic institutions. I don't think that's terribly likely. It's very hard for me to imagine a guy like Milei mobilizing 80% support of Argentines, but it's a scenario to watch for. The third scenario, which I think is the most likely, is not Castillo, total failure, not Bukele, autocracy, but something closer to Bolsonaro, where he governs. He depends a lot on the right-wing establishment to govern, continues a sort of amount of craziness, sort of more talk than action, but sort of symbolic craziness while sort of muddling through in terms of government, never gains that much support, doesn't win over people who didn't like him to begin with, but maintains his initial supporters and ends up with a fairly mediocre government. I think something like Bolsonaro is probably the most likely scenario. So in which case his government and Argentine democracy would kind of muddle through.
Mhm. Argentina is surrounded by many countries that have left-leaning governments. What implications does Milei's election have to do with regional unity? Do you foresee any difficulties there?
Well, one decision that Milei is going to have to decide pretty quickly is what kind of relationship he wants to have with Brazil. His sort of reflexive, extreme anti-left rhetoric is he's going to have to put that on the shelf to have a cooperative relationship with Brazil. Argentina really needs a cooperative relationship with Brazil. So my guess is he'll suck it up and try to establish a decent relationship with Lula and also with the government in Chile. But he could very quickly get into a tiff with Brazil, and that would not help Argentina's economic recovery. I do think, though, that it's not unlikely that we see more right-wing victories in South America. This is a moment for the political right. People are angry. They're angry with the status quo. The status quo has been heavily shaped in South America by the left turn, by left-wing governments in Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and elsewhere. And the problem of crime and criminal violence is the number one issue for many, many Latin American voters. And crime and insecurity is always a right-wing issue. It's an issue that benefits the right. So we shouldn't be surprised if the next government elected in Chile, for example, is right of center. Might even be extreme right. It could be Cast. I wouldn't be shocked to see the right and even the far right elected in Colombia in the next election. Colombia is not an immediate neighbor of Argentina's, of course, but Milei is not going to be alone on the right in South America.
The New York Times called Milei's election, quote, Argentina's Donald Trump moment, end of quote. Do you agree with that assessment?
To a degree. I mean, he is a far-right anti-system candidate who is a political amateur like Trump. He was a vehicle for many voters' political anger like Trump. I think Bolsonaro is probably a better comparison than Milei because Trump rode on the back of an entire political party in a single guy kind of getting on television with crazy hair. So the Trump phenomenon, I think, runs a little deeper. It has to do with longer term changes in the United States over the last half century, whereas Milei is mostly a response to pretty intense voter anger over pretty terrible government performance by both major parties over the last decade in Argentina. And to me, that's more similar to Brazil than to the United States.
I see. Thank you. So what do you think he's going to be able to do in the economic realm? Is he going to surround himself with people with experience? What do you think are the possibilities that he might actually get someplace?
Again, it's always somewhat difficult to predict the behavior of these anti-system outsiders when they get to power. They're amateurs. They get into office and they have this moment, as Fujimori did, as Castillo did, as Bolsonaro did, as Trump did, where they have to sort of react and they have to govern. And they can either sort of continue to govern in a sort of symbolic fantasy land, or they can try to actually get things done. And that will determine the choices that he makes in his cabinet, whether he wants to continue doing symbolic politics, in which case he'll put not necessarily such experienced figures in office in the cabinet, or he will try to get stuff done. I think he's going to try to get stuff done. I think there are many, many important points of convergence between Milei and the mainstream right in Argentina. The mainstream right has radicalized, it's moved to the right. It has been very, very frustrated and fearful during really almost 2 decades of Kirchnerismo, and is ready for radical change. The mainstream right in Argentina, which does have a lot of experienced politicians and experienced technocrats, economists, policymakers, they're on board, unless Milei goes absolutely nuts. They're on board with a lot of the things that Milei is talking about. And I think if Milei invests in that alliance, if he's willing to work with the right wing of what he called the casta, the caste, he can draw on a bunch of pretty mainstream center-right economists. How far they will get, I mean, they're getting stuff through legislation and through the Supreme Court is not going to be easy. So the kinds of radical change that Milei has talked about, and frankly, that many center-right Argentines dream about, even though they don't talk about it so much in public, that kind of change is going to be hard in democracy. It's always hard in democracy. And, Argentina's got a relatively strong presidency. It can do more things by decree than, say, the US president. But Milei, if he really wants to push sort of radical change, a radical privatization of the economy, for example, he's going to have to really sort of push the envelope and govern at the margin of institutions, a little bit like Menem did in the early 1990s. And that's probably going to generate a certain amount of conflict.
You co-wrote a bestseller, How Democracy Dies. What sort of warning signs, if any, do you see here?
I think anytime you elect to the presidency a figure who is not committed to democratic rules of the game, there is a risk. There are warning signs flashing. This is a guy who was talking about election fraud and making baseless allegations of fraud in a very sort of using the Trump playbook. Has also questioned the results of the U.S. election in 2020, obviously baselessly. He's a guy who, had he lost the election, probably would not have done what Sergio Massa did, which is call him up on the night of the election, say, congratulations, I lost, good luck, which is what you're supposed to do in a democracy. All evidence suggests that Milei would not have done that had he won. The fact that Milei chose Victoria Villarreal as his vice presidential candidate suggests somebody who is not overly committed to human rights and liberal democracy. So there are signs that this is not a guy, this is not Raul Alfonsín. This is not a guy who's deeply committed to democratic rules of the game. It's not going to be easy for him to take the initial steps that elected autocrats like Perón and Chavez and Correa took, which is to begin to pack state institutions, to place loyalists in the judiciary and in prosecutor's office and in other key regulatory institutions. He doesn't have, I don't think, the political strength to do that. So if he begins to use kind of plebiscitary appeals like Hugo Chavez did, like Bukele did, to try to sort of mobilize the masses against existing institutions, to kind of bully them or weaken them, that would be a warning sign. I don't think that's terribly likely. I think it always preferable to have a committed Democrat in the presidency than to have somebody who's clearly not a committed Democrat. But Argentine institutions are pretty strong. The Argentine opposition is pretty strong. And it would take a lot for Javier Milei to wreck Argentine democracy. And we clearly have to be on guard. But I think democracy has a good chance of surviving this.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Faculty Voices, to Steve Levitsky. He's the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. He's also director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Thank you for joining us, Steve.
It's a pleasure as always, Jean.